Hi Derek, we're here to discuss your marvellous new booklet that is going to illuminate the Abbey at the festival created by Creek Creative, and you've been commissioned to produce the booklet. I've read it, I think it's marvellous. I think it's a second Canterbury Tales in terms of its storytelling. Perhaps you'd like to start off by talking about the Abbey.
Yeah, well, it's exciting because of what Creek Creative are doing. That not only we're going to have this physical presence of the Abbey illuminated, and we'll see the planned size of the Abbey in its full glory, for the first time for us anyway, and that's really exciting. And with that, I've had the opportunity to draw together a story and a narrative that I hope actually conveys the development of the Abbey, how we came to have an Abbey and a Cluniac order of monks in Faversham, and develop this idea about the tension that existed between the monks and their feudal manor, which provided the finance for the Abbey, and the tension of that with the townspeople that were essentially oyster dredgers, herring fishermen, and we were merchants and traders here, and I think it is that tension between the Abbey and the conflict that occurs with the townspeople that have very different horizons. What's interesting when we look at, say, something like the Graveney boat, which we've incorporated into the story, we know as far back as 950 that people in Faversham were trading, going across the North Sea to the Rhine with boats that could bring back 5 tons of cargo. There's a conflict there, and that conflict is one that's been well documented by local historians, and it's one that I think people are still coming to understand fully, but it's a tension that continues for probably 3 centuries at least, and in the case with the Abbey, ends with the dissolution and the surrender of the Abbey under Thomas Cromwell and Richard Leighton, when Leighton comes to the Abbey and meets Caslock, and they sign the surrender documentation.
By
there were periods when it went into sequestration, and it was transferred over to 2 managers that paid back local merchants because the Abbey had run up large debts. The monks complained. One of the monks actually wrote to the sacrist at St Augustine's Abbey, essentially saying they didn't have corn to plant, no barley had come to the Abbey for 3 weeks. Whether there was an element of exaggeration, but it would appear from these accounts that the monks of the Abbey at periods were almost starving.
So, just tripping back a little bit in time, Derek, after the Norman conquest, there were characters who thought they had an entitlement to the English throne after the death of Henry I. Who were they? What actually instigated the building of the Abbey in the first place?
Well, I guess the story is played out with the 2 main protagonists, with the death of Henry I, and that's Stephen from the House of Blois, and the Empress Matilda, who is often referred to as the Empress Maud, to distinguish her from Queen Matilda, who was Stephen's queen once he took the throne. Stephen was the grandson of William the Conqueror, but the Empress Maud was the daughter of Henry I, so she was the real direct heir. But it was Stephen who saw the opportunity, and he made this dash across the Channel, and this is all part of the story why he may have chosen Faversham, and particularly favoured Faversham as a place to site his abbey and the family mausoleum.
Now there's a strong woman involved in all this. This is
I think there's two
strong women. Consequence of the dash for the throne caused problems within the country, didn't it, with the barons?
Yeah, there's a period of instability, and I think Simon Sharma, he says that actually what you have in the country at the time is the granddaughters and the grandsons of William the Conqueror all jockeying for position, and as Stephen seizes the throne, partly people suggest because of his nature, and also partly because his inability to consolidate his position with complete authority. There's instability amongst the barons throughout the country.
Wasn't Stephen reckoned to be a nice guy?
He's described as a mild guy, he's described by one of the chroniclers as someone the barons basically took advantage of. But I think really that reflects that he hadn't fully consolidated his position, within people saw opportunities to expand their own sort of regional county empires, and so you went into a period for 14 or 15 years of civil war, and it was pretty barbaric, and that's the sort of the vivid thing we remember, because what's interesting when you read these tortures, you realise nothing changes, and we have this ability in periods of instability to do the most barbaric things to one another, and this is what's chronicled at this time. And the other thing that's happening is you're having counties that are experiencing famine, and you have the local economies are collapsing, and whereas at the beginning of Stephen's reign you had one single currency, during the Civil War you have a complete breakdown of the currency, and you have a number of local currencies, and the Empress Maud is minting coins and local barons are minting coins. So you see all the things that actually, if we look around the world today, are happening in countries that have been destabilised, and I think that's the parallels are incredibly interesting.
Just harking back to Matilda, King Stephen's wife, Queen Matilda, didn't she have some part in freeing him from being imprisoned?
Well, while Stephen's locked up in Bristol, she really, with the chief commander of his forces, William of Ypres, who incidentally, to keep him on side, he probably transfers over the manor of Faversham, and then has to actually essentially buy it back so he can grant it to the abbey. But she works with William of Ypres, and the view is if it wasn't for her, London may well have fallen. While he was imprisoned, she continued to conduct the campaign very successfully. Yeah, she was a strong woman, and one of the chroniclers describe her as, when she's with him, she has all the characteristics of a woman, and when she's not with Stephen, i.e. when he's imprisoned, she displays all the characteristics of a man. Make what you will of that, but yeah, essentially it's a story with one of the protagonists being a very strong woman. And of course, on the other side of the Civil War, you've got the Empress Maud from the House of Anjou, and she too is conducting this campaign, large parts of it being fought out in the West Country, And yes, she too is sort of leading armies and playing this role in the continued civil war and instability that goes through this decade and a half, which has become known as the Anarchy. So let's go back, let's pick that up somewhere.
Okay.
So essentially, there is no vested interest. Once Henry ascends to the throne, in maintaining the Abbey in full grandeur, and also it's a mausoleum for the House of Blois. Now we have the House of Anjou, and we have the beginning of the Plantagenet line. So, you know, there's a number of things that are happening here which essentially are bad news for Faversham Abbey, right from its birth.
Right.
And therein lies the tensions, and that tension is not helped because the king needs two things, and this we see reflected at a number of times in the town's history between the foundation of the Abbey and dissolution. That on the one hand, charters granted by the king strengthen and reaffirm the rights of the townspeople to control over their jurisdiction and their rights to certain liberties, and likewise royal charters also reaffirm the position of the Abbey and its place with its feudal rights. So in some ways we're trying to get the best of both worlds, and there's a natural conflict here, and that conflict has been well documented by local historians through the town's charters, and we can see played out through the courts, through lawsuits, the key elements of that tension over a period of sort of 3 centuries. Is they argued that these liberties were given to the townsmen of Faversham in exchange for providing ship service to the king in conjunction with the men of Dover. And with that, you then bring in the other story about the townsman's relationship with the Cinque Ports, and how the town goes from being what became described as an unincorporated limb to an incorporated limb of the Cinque Ports. Although there's still much debate about the development of the Cinque Port organisation, but from the townsman's point of view, they developed their own narrative that they had been granted rights and a certain control over the jurisdiction of the town that went back prior to the foundation of the Abbey.
Rick, a lot of the land we're looking at now was reclaimed by landowners in the from the 13th century onwards. So when we had a spring tide here from Graveney all the way over to Norman Hill, this could look like a large estuary. In fact, you had 7 peninsulas here. Boats going back to the time of the seafarer's story, when we know that the port was being used, and boats that could carry 5 tons of cargo were going across the North Sea to the Rhineland. They would have to negotiate the creeks here to get out to the Swale and the open sea. Very, very hazardous. And even despite the reclamation from the innings of the tide, as late as the 1900s, seafarers didn't like coming down the creek in a spring tide. And it was interesting, we've just been talking to someone we met in the boatyard, and he can recall coming round the bend at the end, just half a mile down there, and as he brought his boat round the bend, he could see nothing but water. Had no visible sight of the creek. Still a hazard today. And we can see from the map here where the last bend in the creek is, Thorn Quay here, and the Abbey construction site being here, very short distance from the deep water port at Thorn Quay. Behind me is the last bend in Faversham Creek before boats reach the port of Faversham, about a half a mile in that direction. And about 200 metres on the other side of the field that I'm looking across was once the deep water quay that served Faversham, Thorn Quay. And boats carrying heavy cargo for the construction of Faversham Abbey, would have come round this bend and then they made their way into the deep water quay at Thorn. From here, the cargo would have been transferred onto smaller boats and taken down to the quays, the smaller quays at Faversham. And we also know that there was a road that ran from Thorn Quay in the direction towards the Abbey site. Now, boats would have been bringing in, it's estimated, in total about 10,500 tonnes of the building material that was used in the construction of Faversham Abbey. And that building material came via the coastal waters and across the channel, because that was the method by which the heavy cargo would have been transported. And this building material would have included slate from Devon, Kentish ragstone and Reigate stone. That would have been shipped from places such as Hythe and along the Medway and round the North Kent coast. And there was also stone that was brought across the channel, stone from Caen. Now for us, stone from Caen features both at the beginning of our story of the Abbey and at the end, 4 centuries after the Abbey's foundation in 1148. And then we come to the Dissolution and the eventual destruction and demolition of the Abbey. Now, we do know that in 1541, a surveyor was put in charge of the defensive building works for the fortifications at Calais. And I guess for me, what's so intriguing about this story and the link with the stone from Caen is that at the beginning of our story with the construction of Faversham Abbey, much of the building material was shipped across from France. And then 4 centuries later, after the Dissolution, when ownership of the Abbey is transferred to Cheney, Lord Warden of the Cinque Port, there's a distinct possibility that large amounts of that stone that originally had come over from France was shipped back to France and used in the fortifications at Calais. I'm standing outside Arden's house in Abbey Street. Abbey Street was once known as Court Street, and this is the last remaining part of what was once the Abbey site. And this was the outer gatehouse of the Abbey. And it was on a July day in 1538 that Thomas Layton came down carrying a document, and it was the document of surrender for the Abbey. According to the historian Southhouse, writing in 1671, following the dissolution of the Abbey, the lead coffins of King Stephen, Queen Matilda and their son Prince Eustace were taken from the mausoleum, which was probably housed in the chapel of the Petit Rude. The bodies were removed from the lead coffins and their bodies were cast into the creek. And with the dissolution of the religious houses, the eventual demolition of Faversham Abbey, that could be where this story ends. But there's another tale to be told, because Southhouse, writing not too long after the dissolution, was familiar with the area, and yet he's criticised. He wasn't able to draw on local tradition about the abbey that once stood here. He wasn't able to identify the exact location of the site of the Church of St Saviour's. And it's through the tenacity of Edward Crowe, who starts investigations in the orchard strewn with rubble where the Abbey precincts had stood, that Crowe uncovers 100 foot of Abbey wall. And for the first time since the dissolution, people in Faversham had an idea of where this grand Abbey church of St Saviour's would have stood.